Hello to all of you from all around the world. Welcome to the Frontiers Forum deep dive session on reimagining healthcare. Today's session builds on the article Standing the Test of COVID-19, Charting the New Frontiers of Medicine, that we published in Frontiers in Science, our flagship journal, in May this year, and which has already been viewed 35,000 times in the scientific community today. I am Laure Sonnier. I am the executive editor of Frontiers in Science. And as a neurobiologist, a policy expert, and open science advocate, I'm very excited about today's event. It is actually the result of a great collaboration with Professor Michel Goldman, Professor Philippe Sansonetti, and several key experts in the field, many of you being with us today. So a big thank you to all of you from the bottom of my heart. Before we start, I would like to just tell you a little bit about Frontiers in Science. So we did launch our flagship title 18 months ago. It is a multidisciplinary open access journal. Our editorial scope is guided by the Sustainable Development Goals and focuses on the science that the world needs most to accelerate solutions for healthy lives on a healthy planet. So how do we do it? We commission exceptional peer-reviewed articles from world-renowned scientists addressing key global challenges in human and planetary health. And then around all of this article, we built what we call an article hub, a hub of multi-audience content, including viewpoint, editorials, policy articles, and also content for children and the general public, to really extend the reach of our journal across science, policy, and society. So actually today, we think that no other publisher is doing this the way we do it. And we are very proud to be driving innovation in publishing so that exceptional science can reach everyone in society and really accelerate progress for all. This week, we celebrated the launch of our 13th article hub, and there are many more to come, so stay tuned. And for today, the expert scientific discussion on reimagining healthcare post-COVID-19 will be moderated by Lee Baker, our editorial advisor at Frontiers in Science. I'm delighted now to hand you over to him. Thank you all and enjoy the event. Lee, over to you.
Thanks, Laure. Thanks. Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining today. This deep dive is indeed focused on the lead article titled Standing the Test of COVID-19, Charting the New Frontiers of Medicine, which we published in May of this year. The article was led by Professor Michel Goldman from the Université Libre de Bruxelles and also Professor Philippe Sansonetti from the Institut Pasteur and Collège de France, as Laure alluded to. They and a panel of other renowned authors build on the many lessons of COVID-19, which emphasize how disease concepts, in their words, must reflect the dynamic, heterogeneous interrelationships between physical characteristics, genetics, comorbidities, environmental exposures, and socioeconomic determinants of health throughout life. They explore how the pandemic accelerated the use of revolutionary technologies, including vaccine platforms, precision medicine approaches, and data science. And they also outline how the future of medicine lies in new forms of interdisciplinarity, integrating knowledge and skills from biomedical sciences and healthcare, public health, economics, social sciences, regulation, and policy, along with measures to ensure equitable access to medical innovation across populations and countries. So this is the article hub that Laure described just now. It features an editorial by Professor Giuseppe Ramuzzi and Luca Perico of the Mario Negro Institute in Italy, along with a viewpoint article by Dr. Olusoji Adeyi, who joins us today, together with Prashant Navav from INSEAD and Harvard, and Michel Kazachkine from the Geneva Graduate Institute and Columbia University. There is also a policy outlook by Brigitte Autran of the Sorbonne University of Medicine. As Laure mentioned, there's also a lay explainer and infographics and video and an article in Frontiers for Young Minds. That's our journal, written for kids and peer-reviewed by kids for kids. So here's the agenda for today. First of all, Professor Michel Goldman, project leader, will start off to set the scene by explaining a little bit about the article and what it explores. Sadly, Professor Philippe Sonnier cannot join us today at short notice. He sends his apologies, but we have Professor Thomas Hartung from Johns Hopkins, Dr. Pamela Tenaerts from Medable Inc. in USA, Dr. Melanie Saville from PATH in the UK, and Dr. Olusoji Adeyi. And all of these authors will join in a panel discussion. So to our first speaker, Professor Michel Goldman is president of the Institute for Interdisciplinary Innovation and Healthcare at the and is emeritus professor of immunology at the Université Libre de Bruxelles. He significantly advanced our understanding of the immune system and its implications for human health. And in recognition of this, just early this year, he was awarded the Blaise Pascal Medal in Medicine and Life Sciences by the European Academy of Sciences for his contributions to immunology and healthcare innovation. He was the first executive director of the Innovative Medicines Initiative, the IMI, a joint venture between the European Commission and the European Federation of Pharmaceutical Industries and Associations, designed specifically to foster collaboration between academia and industry to translate scientific discoveries into new therapies. Michel is also the field chief editor of Frontiers in Medicine. So Michel, welcome. Thank you for bringing this article to Frontiers in Science, and I hand over to you.
Good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, wherever you are in the world, and welcome to this webinar about the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the future of clinical medicine and medical research. Let me first thank the 18 co-authors of the paper that he mentioned and the team at Frontier in Science who was most helpful. I would like to also thank the colleagues who have joined us today for this webinar to provide important insights during the discussion time. Today, we will emphasize the many types of collaboration across scientific disciplines, but also across public and private sectors. Collaboration which made the fight against the pandemic so efficient, at least in high-income countries. We will come back to that in the discussion. Let us start by looking at the growth of publication in clinical science and public health. Many of these publications were based on unprecedented collaborations between clinicians and basic scientists, and often involved researchers from industrial companies. Although the impact of the pandemic on publications about vaccines, immunology, and public health was expected, one should emphasize the growth in the number of papers on telemedicine and digital health. Together with data science, computational analytics, and artificial intelligence, the so-called systems medicine will clearly have a growing importance in healthcare. Regarding public health, it will also benefit from advances in statistical and mathematical modeling, which contribute to predict the evolution of the COVID-19 pandemic, especially when vaccines were not already available. Let's now consider the groundbreaking innovations which emerged during the pandemic. In this introduction, we will focus on the development of vaccines, collaborative endeavors, therapeutic antibodies, and precision medicines. Other important aspects will be addressed by my colleagues during the discussion time. Let's start with the mRNA vaccines platform. The efficiency of mRNA vaccine against the SARS-CoV-2 virus paved the way to several applications of this technology for other infectious disease, but also for new therapies of cancer. This is really important to understand the huge impact of COVID-19 on medicine in general. As a matter of fact, the COVID-19 pandemic radically changed the vaccine development process. Pre-pandemic, the time from the discovery to the proof of concept in the clinic spanned for more than 10 years very often. And during the COVID-19, new technologies dramatically accelerate the process, with phase 1 clinical trials beginning only 2 months after vaccine development began. Collaboration between virologists, molecular biologists, physicists, and chemists were essential in the early phase of mRNA vaccine development. Indeed, 2 seminal discoveries enabled the development of those vaccines. The first was the demonstration that modified nucleosides enhance the stability of mRNA and reduce its inflammatory potential. The second was the discovery that encapsulation of mRNA in lipid nanoparticles could both facilitate the delivery of mRNA in vivo, but also serve as an important adjuvant through the stimulation of the innate immune system. In parallel, the public sector spent more than $15 billion to encourage companies to invest in manufacturing facilities and to perform phase 1, 2, and 3 clinical trials in parallel rather than sequentially. This public investment removed the financial risk from the private sector and allowed COVID-19 vaccine to be developed in just 10 months without skipping any of the steps essential to establish safety and efficacy. In short, the COVID-19 pandemic accelerated the availability of novel technologies, validated the incredible contribution of vaccines to society and the global economy, and emphasized the critical role of the public sector in creating the necessary condition for rapid vaccine development. Indeed, multi-stakeholders, public-private collaborative initiative blossomed during the COVID-19 pandemic. And again, we will come back to this in the discussion. Just mentioning here the pairing of the University of Oxford with AstraZeneca and the collaboration between Pfizer and BioNTech as prototypic an example. The COVID-19 crisis also triggered a wave of international collaboration, including initiatives such as COVAX, which again will be further discussed. Public-private partnerships are expected to develop beyond the field of vaccines, especially in domains where the pharmaceutical industry doesn't anticipate sufficient return on investment. The experience of the Innovative Medicines Initiative, which gave rise to the Innovative Health Initiative in Europe, and of the Critical Path Institute in the US, demonstrate that public-private partnership can combine the strengths of the industry with the creativity present in academia, especially for fields with insufficient investment, such as dementia, autism, and antimicrobial resistance. Projects focusing on pre-competitive research allowed already unprecedented collaboration, even between competing companies. As example, we can mention the search for novel biomarkers of drug efficacy and safety, and the establishment of platforms for early drug screening. The COVID-19 pandemic also accelerated the development of antiviral drugs, which should further progress in the near future, and also of therapeutic monoclonal antibody, which were most useful in individuals who could not be protected by vaccines. These mean especially immunosuppressed individuals. For these reasons, major research efforts are focusing on the development of long-acting, broadly reactive monoclonal antibodies with optimal binding and neutralizing capacities. Insights gained during the research and development of anti-COVID-19 monoclonals will greatly help the ongoing development of novel antibodies against several other infectious diseases. Currently, as you know, the most widely used monoclonal protect against RSV, the respiratory syncytial virus. Monoclonals against Clostridium difficile and Ebola virus are already approved, and new targets under development, includes Zika virus and HIV, as well as malaria and antimicrobial resistant bacterial infections. Let's now move on to precision medicine. It is commonly viewed as a response to the phenotypic heterogeneity of diseases. It has already revolutionized cancer therapy, providing more efficient and less toxic targeted treatment. It is about deciphering the molecular mechanisms underlying a patient-specific disease process using genomics and other omics. This allows the identification of biomarkers for disease prediction, prevention, and to provide the right treatment to the right patient at the right time. Now, the question is, does this concept of precision medicine apply to an infectious disease affecting hundreds of millions of people, killing millions of them? And the reality of COVID-19 told us that this is indeed the case. The understanding of at the molecular level of mechanisms underlying host-virus interaction has been key to address the pathogenesis of the disease, its treatment, and its prevention. The phenotypic heterogeneity of COVID-19 was striking from the onset of the pandemic. It was immediately apparent that the same virus could be deadly in some individuals and yet go unnoticed in others. Although genetic factor controlling the type 1 interferon pathway explains some cases of severe disease in young and healthy individuals, it became clear that old age was a major risk factor, together with obesity, type 2 diabetes, and other comorbidities. Now, it was very clear that long COVID, let's say the post-acute COVID-19 sequelae, are extremely draw increasing attention because of their high incidence and public health impact. And it is rather clear that there is a need there for a better classification. Indeed, you know, many patients are regrouped under the same denomination of long COVID, whereas post-COVID-19 damages are very diverse and probably involve several mechanisms. Because of this huge phenotypic heterogeneity, long COVID is an area where a precision medicine approach is much needed. In this vein, a recent study suggests that immune profiling combined with machine learning might be helpful by defining subgroup of patients with long COVID. Now, precision medicine must take into consideration the impact of the environment on health. The clustering of severe COVID-19 cases in certain Italian regions reveal the impact of air pollution on the outcome of the disease. Indeed, current efforts for improved response and preparedness to new pandemics should consider the environmental exposure on the outcome of infectious disease, both in the short and the long term. Environmental insults occurring throughout the life course will have to be integrated in precision medicine approaches for non-infectious diseases as well. Taken together, they represent the exposome. It includes chemical factors of virus origin, physical factors, as well as psychosocial and behavioral factors. Together with the genetic makeup, the composition of the microbiome, and data derived from proteomics, transcriptomics, metabolomics, and other omics technology, the exposome will contribute to the development of a new taxonomy of several non-communicable diseases, for example, type 2 diabetes and Alzheimer's dementia. Patients clustered according to different variables associated with different outcomes might then benefit from a tailored management. Finally, it's important to stress again that the expansion of precision medicine in all fields will be enabled by advances in artificial intelligence. AI is now a critical tool in drug and vaccine discovery, data integration, and evidence synthesis from scientific literature. Let us conclude by mentioning and emphasizing that the future of medicine will depend on interdisciplinary, patient-specific, and data-driven approaches to foster both precision medicine tailored to the individual characteristic of each patient and a new, more modern type of public health for the benefit of large population. We should also underline that all this requires commitment to open science, innovative partnerships, and patient-centric methodologies. And finally, these new visions should be implemented in low and middle-income countries, as well as in rich countries, to make medical science of the future a science for all. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Michel, for setting the scene there for us. Beautiful presentation. We're going to move on now to a panel discussion. And so I'd like to introduce the rest of the panel. We will be taking questions soon, so do keep your questions coming in. But just to introduce the panel first, as I mentioned, first of all, Philippe Sansonetti can't make it today, but we have Professor Thomas Hartung. Thomas is Professor of Evidence-Based Toxicology and the Director of the Centre of Alternatives to Animal Testing at the Blomberg School of Public Health and the Whiting School of Engineering at Johns Hopkins University. He's also Professor of Pharmacology and Toxicology at the University of Konstanz in Germany. Thomas is at the forefront of a revolution in toxicology, driving a paradigm shift from animal testing methods towards cutting-edge organoids and the integration of artificial intelligence in these systems. Thomas is also the field chief editor of Frontiers in Artificial Intelligence. And as it happens, in February 2023, he published in Frontiers of Science with a large collaborative group an article on organoid intelligence, a new frontier in biocomputing and brain organoids with machines and artificial intelligence. Welcome, Thomas. We also have Dr. Pamela Tenaerts. Pamela is Chief Scientific Officer at Medical Inc. in the USA. She's a leader in the use of technology, evidence-based metrics, and best practices to modernize clinical trials. She was formerly the Executive Director at the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiatives, orchestrating efforts to engage all stakeholders to improve clinical trials. In particular, she advocates for inclusive, patient-centered research and fosters collaboration between industry, regulators, researchers, and patients. Pamela is a member of the board of the Society of Clinical Trials, the Scientific Leadership Council of the Digital Medicine Society, the Good Clinical Trial Collaborative, and the National Academies of Science Medicine Forum on Drug Discovery, Development, and Translation. Dr. Melanie Saville is Chief Scientific Officer at PATH in the UK, specializing in virology. She has over 20 years' experience in developing vaccines, including seasonal and pandemic influenza, rabies, Japanese encephalitis, dengue, Ebola, and of course, SARS-CoV-2, COVID. She was previously Executive Director of Vaccine Research and Development at the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness and Innovations, CEPI, where she led the R&D and development workstream for COVAX. At PATH, Melanie leads a global team dedicated to the development, introduction, and scale of vaccines, medical devices, and diagnostics. And finally, Dr. Olusoji Adeyi is President of Resilient Health Systems in the USA. He's a leading authority in global health. He's dedicated his career to strengthening health systems in low and middle income countries, with senior roles at the World Bank, where he led initiatives to combat HIV, TB, and malaria, and the AIDS Prevention Initiative in Nigeria, funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. As the founder of Resilient Health Systems, he focuses on creating sustainable, adaptable healthcare models that can withstand crises and improve population health outcomes, integrating health systems with economic and social policies to enhance their efficacy and resilience. So, welcome to you all. Thank you very much for joining us today. So, moving from what Michel talked about, Michel started off by covering in particular the developments in vaccines, the scientific and technological basis for the mRNA vaccines that were so pivotal during COVID. Melanie, if I could come to you first to comment on how are these developments being taken forward? Obviously, we have continued development of COVID vaccines, but perhaps even more forward-looking beyond those. How are these developments going forwards? How have they been hardwired into how we develop vaccines for current and future threats?
Thank you, Lee, and it's a pleasure to be here for this discussion and amongst such a distinguished panel. So thank you for the opportunity. And maybe to start off with, to build on what Michel presented in terms of vaccines and the extraordinary progress that was made in COVID-19, with the first vaccine receiving emergency use listing on the 8th of December 2020, which was just 326 days after the sequence was published. And there are a number of factors that came together, both technical and more operational, that actually made that happen. And Michel pointed out one of the major ones there, and that is the rapid response platforms, and mRNA is the classic example. I think there is another factor that is actually also important, because it's not just having a vaccine, it's having an effective vaccine, and that is integrating into the immunogen design, into the design of the antigen for the vaccine, what had been known about making sure you have the pre-fusogenic form of an antigen, which is much more immunogenic and therefore much more effective than using the native form. So these are two pieces that really came together with the more operational pieces, like starting manufacturing before you've even got any data, and scaling even before you get into clinical trials. That is a little bit more of a financial risk rather than a technical risk, but moving forward with those technical pieces and having the finance to do that, recognizing that some of those vaccines will fail. Are some of these hardwired into what we do today? I think the answer is yes and no to that. In terms of the immunogen design, we've seen that come on leaps and bounds, with more computational designers now coming into play. So being able to think about really hundreds of thousands, perhaps even, of immunogen designs that can be rapidly evaluated and put into a vaccine, which might have taken years in the past. On the mRNA front, I think the real advantage of mRNA is indeed the speed to which you can get to clinical trial material, or the speed to which you can get to scale for a commercial product. And this is because of the more generic nature of the manufacturing process, unlike other vaccines, which you kind of have to nurture like your own children over time to get them to where they need to be. But once you've done an mRNA vaccine, you've got a piece of mRNA to make roughly the same size. The process is pretty much identical. So you can move from a year or two, perhaps, to getting to clinical trials to really a few days or a few weeks. And that also builds on other things, like what we've done with mRNA in oncology. So actually what we have seen, certainly with the Modernas and the BioNTechs of this world, seeing new targets, whether that's influenza, CMV as another example, really moving through the development process much more rapidly. And a lot of that is to do with the technology and the ability to be able to make it much quicker. So I've really been impressed with the ability to move that forward so quickly, and the potential then for other vaccines on mRNA to be coming to the market much quicker. Having said that, a word of warning: mRNA is probably not the answer to all of the infections that we have. It gives you a specific immune profile with the right antigen, but there are many other types of vaccines which may give a better response, a single dose, other things like that, that mean that you may want to move forward with other technologies that will, because of those inherent differences, take longer, but will ultimately be a more effective vaccine. So there, from a technology perspective, I think some of the things that are really important. Obviously, there are many other areas of innovation that took place that can also be used moving forward.
Super. Thanks for that very full answer. And I think, do we take it a kind of a positive but, if I can summarize that in a word, progress. Olusoji, if we could bring you in here, you wrote a companion piece, a viewpoint on the lead article we're talking about, and specifically you drew attention to the need for political and delivery, if you like, so that there was an equitable benefit, if you like, across populations. Of course, there's the ongoing WHO pandemic accord and treaty discussions going on for the future pandemics. But for now, could I ask you to comment on benefit sharing, let's say, and benefit co-development? How do you reflect on that, again, looking to the future? What do we need to do better in the future so that the progress and the technologies that Melanie's outlined benefit as many people as we can?
Thank you very much, Lee, and I'm delighted to join this panel. Building on what's been said, I think among the lessons we learned from the COVID pandemic was the huge gap between, on the one hand, record time development of vaccines, and then very inequitable delivery of those vaccines. And I stress this because it is not vaccines that saves lives, it is vaccination that saves lives. Secondly, just to concentrate our minds a little, I will quibble strongly, I must say, with the notion that COVAX was a success. So in this, I very strongly differ with what has been said previously. By September of 2021, COVAX had delivered something in the region of 319 million vaccines, which amounted to some 16% of what it had promised to deliver by the end of that year. I think most of us will agree that if a student scored 16% in an exam, that would be a categorical F at best. Okay? So that's a quantitative failure. In addition, there were qualitative failures in governance, whereby it was a very paternalistic setup of a small group of people dictating to the rest of the world. So COVAX was not a success. I just want to be on the record on that. Now, on the what you have said about, what you've asked about the ongoing the negotiations at the WHO on benefit sharing, I think that illustrates an example of a very uncomfortable word in global health and scientific circles, and that's power or power dynamics. One would think that a sensible thing that everybody could agree upon would be, free and open access to the information on biogenomes wherever those microbes are discovered and wherever the genomes are sequenced. And concomitantly, benefit sharing of the products that are derived from that information. But that has not been the case, and that remains not the case. So this is a big problem at the core of the breakdown in discussions at the WTO, at the WHO. What does this mean? My colleagues, that's Professor Michel Goldman and Professor Prashant Yadav and I, in the short piece that we published in the special edition, we make the case that, in fact, we need to start out looking through an equity lens and then building backward. So if indeed the holy grail is record time equitable delivery of products such as but not limited to vaccines, then we need to pay more attention to the delivery systems, the service delivery systems in place across low and middle income countries. And that crucial to this will be end-to-end manufacturing capabilities in those countries. Shifting away from the paradigm that products need necessarily to be manufactured in high-income or upper-middle-income countries and then shipped to low and lower-middle-income countries. We also fully support the open science model, contrary to what has been the case. And if all of these are to be achieved, then in our view, we really must pay attention to the architecture for access, especially what happens at institutions. Because as of today, most, if not all, of the large global institutions have a congenital defect whereby the power dynamics are set up not necessarily to enable equitable access, but to fundamentally serve the interests of a few most powerful entities around the world. Now, this is not to query the good intentions of individuals. No, folks are out there trying to do the best that they can, but the institutional construct needs revisiting. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Olusoji. That's a very powerful message. Michel, I think you wanted to comment on something. Is that right?
Yes. Actually, I think that you're right. Vaccination is really more important than the vaccine itself. And talking about vaccination, the route of vaccination is obviously important. And if Philippe Sansonetti would be with us, because he is a specialist of mucosal immunity, he would certainly emphasize the need to develop mucosal vaccines, which should allow a better protection. And today we realize that indeed current vaccines do not protect, fortunately, against mild form of infection, but clearly we need to do more and better in terms of mucosal immunity and in terms of stimulating the mucosal immune response, which might facilitate actually the dissemination of the vaccine across the world.
Thank you, Michel. Before we just move on from this, we've had a couple of questions. I'll try and bring in questions as they as we come, if you like, to the relevant topics. I'm going to group a couple of questions here. For example, from Carlin Gazarian. I guess it's just before we move away from vaccines, we've been asked to give your perspectives. Perhaps you could ask Melanie, yourself, maybe Michel as well, knowing what we know about COVID-19 and its evolution, its ongoing evolution, how it's changing. Where do we think it is with respect to any future pandemic potential of that virus or offshoots? And otherwise, your sense of future pandemic virus threats and therefore the engine, if you like, for Melanie, the developments you talked about before, and Olusoji, the importance of getting the development pathways the right way around in the first place. Melanie, if I could bring you back on that.
Yeah, so it's a great question. Actually, you know, when I was at CEPI and set up at CEPI, we thought about what were the sort of targets that we should be working on to prepare for epidemics and pandemics. And one of the pathogens that were chosen were MERS, because not actually particularly because of MERS, because although MERS does have some impact in the Middle East in particular, there are actually relatively few cases. But we've known from MERS and from SARS-1 that coronaviruses represent you know, a huge potential pandemic threat. So we actually learned quite a lot already from the work that was done on MERS that could be transferred to SARS-CoV-2. That's only a subset of coronavirus. There are alpha coronaviruses, and some of those cause common cold. So one of the concepts that is moving forward, it's something that I think started at the NIH with Bernie Graham, and it's something that CEPI has sort of amplified, is the notion of developing virus family vaccine libraries. So think about what are the types of virus families that are likely to cause pandemics. It could be paramyxoviruses. We have Nipah virus there. Obviously, influenza viruses are there, coronaviruses, and really think about what are the families that are likely to cause the next pandemic, and actually get working on those now. As we know from SARS-2, it was from what we knew from the past, from maybe either other work that was being done on platforms. So there is the notion of really trying to get, you know, prototype vaccines already, so you can learn as much upfront. You can get safety data. I think we always have to talk about safety, not just speed. Safety data, understand the immune response to these viruses. So when something new comes along, it might be more akin to having a strain change for influenza or a strain change for COVID-19 for a vaccine, which obviously is much quicker. And you can build on all of the data that you've already generated. So it's a fantastic question, and that's really one of the concepts that has come forward recently to really help us down that road to be better prepared.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Perhaps we could move on to the second sort of major topic that Michel came to, and that was on precision medicine and the nature of it in integrating multiple data sets and the importance of novel data sciences in enabling that, and AI being key there. Thomas, if we could bring you in, your own work is highly integrative in this sense. I wonder if you could comment, perhaps Michel had mentioned long COVID. I know you do research in brain systems. Could you explain what happened in COVID, how did that accelerate progress in this setting, and where is it going in the future? What do you anticipate to see in the coming years?
I think the first thing we should say, Lee, is that the scientific response to the pandemic was a tremendous success. I checked today, in PubMed, there were 440,000 articles on COVID and SARS-CoV-2, which means it is about 10% of all articles in PubMed over the last 5 years, which are addressing this topic. When science has delivered. And we see this as the consequences of drug development. Yeah? And we see that there were a couple of technologies which coincided with COVID as disruptive technologies. These are, among others, the complex in vitro systems, which we like to call microphysiological systems, so stem cell derived, multicellular, three-dimensional, often even multi-organ systems, which are really on the rise. And quite interestingly, and AI I will come to in a second, yeah. Quite interestingly, there is still today not really an animal model which reflects human COVID. Yeah? The organ contribution, the long-term COVID, we don't really have a proper model for this. And I would even like to argue that most of the acceleration in developing vaccines in 1 year, antivirals in 1.5, came from deprioritizing the preclinical animal phase, which is very long and very expensive, and is making a lot of these development times. I mean, the Moderna vaccine was injected into humans after 2 months after the sequence was done, with a single animal experiment which showed that mice produce antibodies. Nothing protective in any model or so. But microphysiological systems of all of the different organ systems have been shown to replicate the different organ contributions. But let's come to AI. AI is a power technology. I don't need to tell nowadays, everybody. Since 2010, AI is doubling in capacity every 3 months. So this year's AI is 8 times more powerful than last year's. And so from the beginning of COVID and to now, we are about 5,000 times more powerful in what we have at hand. I will not say that AI has been driving the response to COVID in no way, because we need data. I checked after 9 months, only 0.3% of papers published were based on AI in the COVID sector. At the moment, we are at 2.4% of all of these 440,000 papers. So it shows you it is gaining ground, but it's also quite explainable because you need data before you can employ AI. And it's also it is also then that now only we are powerful enough to use it in some areas. So I think the pandemic has shown us that we can accelerate drug development. that we can have disruptive technologies at hand, which are getting to prime time. And to some extent, we can de-emphasize the use of traditional animal studies in these processes.
Do you think the challenges of, for example, long COVID being so heterogeneous, both within the variety of effects on different organ systems and between patients, well, heterogeneity perhaps at every level, is the research effort coordinated enough to be able to address this increasingly well-recognized global problem, right? Is it being well enough coordinated so that, you know, the multiplicity of the disease can be addressed? Would that be fair to say?
I think that we are only developing the tools of full models of human metabolism, digital twins, but this is the direction to move forward. The basis for this is first to understand the general interaction of these pathogens, in this case with the human body and the entire sequence of events there in a networked system. Yeah? And this is something only AI is promising to do, because there's no way that we could integrate otherwise these informations. And it is in essence to have human models which reflect the diversity of human beings in order to come to personalized medicine. And this is where the microphysiological systems come in, where induced pluripotent stem cells from patients can be used. Right. And this is in strong contrast to the inbred and outbred animal strains we are using, which are not giving us any diversity and also very, very much deviation in physiology. So I think here it is really, it was the proof of principle. It has been the lighthouse function of saying we need human systems which are quick. We need a comprehensive understanding which can be done in an objective way. And so these technologies really have benefited from this.
Thanks. Thank you. Pamela, if we could turn to you, the COVID pandemic interrupted a lot of clinical research, which was well documented in the literature, the number of trials that were halted or discontinued or cancelled, pointing to issues in resilience of research systems globally. At the same time, personalized medicine warrants or requires different kinds of trial designs owing to the personalization of the therapy, if you like. So your own work obviously is very much in this space. So could you comment on how clinical trials have developed since and how COVID has catalyzed, if you like, their new applications of these new trial designs?
Happy to, and also very honored to be on this esteemed panel with everyone here. So yeah, so what I work on is the piece between the technology of finding a vaccine, which we've talked about earlier, and I'm so impressed with all the work that was done during COVID and continues to be done, like Mpox and all those other things are going way faster than we've ever had ability to get a vaccine into clinical trials. And that's the piece that eventually will get us to vaccination, of course, because medical products have to be efficacious and safe to administer to humans. So the COVID pandemic was very interesting because it kind of exacerbated everything we knew wasn't really going well with clinical trials. I mean, clinical trials do an amazing job, but they're expensive. They used to be slow, and the access to trials is not equitable. And not only is the access not equitable, we don't always, well, most of the time, we don't include representative populations, the people that actually are affected by the disease and eventually will be taking the investigational medical product. So a couple of things that happened since is, of course, during COVID, things were shut down. And then to your point, we didn't have an infrastructure for clinical trials where the pandemic was happening. So in the United States, we had pockets, COVID came in pockets here and there. We didn't always have clinical research sites where the pockets of COVID were. And so that is one thing. The other thing is that the prioritization of clinical trials is also really important, because if something like a pandemic happens, we have to focus and put work together, the collaborative effort of working on the trials that matter. And in the UK, they did a wonderful job with the recovery. It was prioritized by the Ministry of Health that was going to be the one trial everyone was participating in. And that trial gave us amazing results and immediate things we could do during the pandemic with steroids first and other things to follow. And also saying which things did not work. The other thing that happens is that the design of studies isn't always conducive to being done everywhere. Like, we make trials too complicated, and we really need to think about the design of studies so that more people can participate. And in this case, the more people are the more sites. More people can help include, participate in the clinical trial process is the infrastructure piece. And then lastly, like I said, representative populations. One of the big vaccine trials was stopped at one point because they did not have the right proportion of African-American participants. And so they were stopped and had to figure out how to include them. They did it, and then they were able to continue, so that then we knew that the evidence gathered in that clinical trial was applicable to people who were most affected by it. So what are some of the things that changed for us to be able to do that? So we started deploying technology more. We had been deploying technology. We had used e-consent, for example, in a trial in 2010. It wasn't widely adopted. We have been using ECOAS. We have been using sensors, but during the pandemic, it was sort of, you couldn't do a trial without it. And this was both the trials for COVID, but the other trials that were ongoing and in places like oncology, those people needed those trials to stay active, to be able to get access to drugs. So the advent of technology was really great. And then the other thing that is more to the precision medicine side is that we really started honing in on the master protocols. Like I said, recovery was a masterful, well, that's funny, a masterful way of developing a trial where you could look at multiple therapies in the same way. But in the United States, we also had I-SPY, which was a breast cancer trial, and they flipped and kind of started doing COVID work. And then REMAP-CAP had been developed earlier on for pneumonia, and they switched over to REMAP-CAP for a COVID trial. So the technology that's been used that is sort of came to the fore is, digital decentralized clinical trials. Like I said, it's, e-consent, clinical outcome assessments that can be done on people's phone. It's using sensors to capture activity instead of maybe a 6-minute walk test at the doctor's office, or televisits. And so all those things really have changed how we do clinical trials, because not only is that important for COVID, when people, clinical trial sites were shut down, people couldn't come to the site, but in many other clinical trials, people cannot come to sites. They live too far away. It's not easy for them to do it, or their jobs don't allow it. I used to be a cashier when I was in medical school during the summer. I could never have said, oh, so hold on a second, I'm going to go do I have a clinical trial visit for, I need to leave. Whereas now you could potentially do it during your, lunch break. And so I think all those things were fast adopted. And then now we're we saw a little bit of a retrenching after the COVID pandemic ended, because people tend to go back to what they know best. But I think what's happening now is that we had the hopes of what technology could do. It's going to give us better access. It's going to increase enrollment and make it faster to enroll. We're going to be able to get to answers faster. And what we're now seeing is efforts to actually gather that data so that people can actually make informed decisions about which technology to use, which decentralized element to use in which clinical trial. And the PACT consortium, for example, has released or is going to be releasing a first-year report that shows, what are the trials that are using this technology. It's about real clinical trials that are happening. They have about 69 trials in their database right now. 20% of the trials are finished. The other ones are still ongoing. So we don't know the full extent of what the evidence is going to show, but we're seeing that clinical trials that use decentralized elements typically beat planned timelines, so they go faster, and that's a good thing. We knew in COVID that was something we needed to do. We needed to get the answer fast, and I'm still impressed by the 326 days, or whichever number, Melanie. I mean, that was unheard of, because vaccine trials were 14-year endeavors, just to put that in perspective. And then we were also showing that we're actually reaching a more diverse population. And that's emerging evidence as well. So I think the other part of it is master protocols are now being used more often, and they're not just multiple drugs for one disease. They're also one drug for multiple genetic mutations and multiple diseases to kind of get that precision medicine. So I think we're making great strides, and the pandemic has also shown that clinical trials need to happen in the community, which is not always, they happen a lot at tertiary centers, but no, not everybody can travel 2-3 hours to those tertiary centers. And even the regulators are keeping up. ICH E6 R3 is creating a special annex dedicated to how these alternative models of clinical trials could work. The FDA last week had a big clinical trials big week for us with three guidances that were released, the final guidance on DCT. And by the way, the regulators had been very responsive during COVID to clarify what people could do in their trials, because most of these things were not really clear to people at the time, but they're now sort of creating guidances to make it permanent, so to speak. And so the FDA had a final guidance on DCTs, and they had a draft guidance on trials in the community setting, which again speak to the resilience of the system and being able to do this in many places. And then they also had a clinical trial guidance on multi-regional oncology trials. And just yesterday, the WHO launched their guidance on good clinical trials. And that is just sort of speaking again to the design and making sure that we design trials that work for everyone. So I'll give it back to you at that point.
Thank you. Wonderful. I'll just again bring in a couple of questions here, and also Olusoji, if we could bring you in. A few people have asked about questions related to this accessibility of the right, if you like, to participate in research, and increasing inclusivity. From your own perspective, not necessarily within a country, but between countries, between the high income and low income countries. What's your perspective on the use of new trial designs to help foster research and development in other regions, in low and middle income countries, regions that perhaps it hasn't been able to do before? What's their potential to broaden that?
Thanks. Not being an expert in clinical trials myself, I would not want to pontificate outside my circle of competence. So I'm going to come at it from the perspective of the broad picture global policies and how they influence pathways to resolving that challenge. I think it comes down to a matter of intentionality, i.e., in pursuing a particular research objective, who makes the choice of the research questions to start with? Who makes the decision? Who is in charge of recruiting a team or the teams to conduct the research? Who secures the funding, and who becomes the principal investigator or the co-principal investigators in that research? You begin to get the picture, because it comes to what, in my view, is a very uncomfortable word again in global health. That's power. Okay, the inheritance in global health research and biomedical research, permission to speak frankly, is that quite often the part center and the responses to those questions I've just posed are dominated disproportionately by a few, relatively few centers in high-income countries. And those in the low-income countries are referred to as the field, or the collaborators in the field. So the uncomfortable question to leaders in global health research, especially biomedical research, then is, how prepared are we, or how prepared are they for a world in which that power imbalance is corrected, and you suddenly find a situation in which the co-principal investigators in Nepal and Namibia and Nicaragua decide those questions and then invite scientists in Canada and Germany and Japan to work with them? I think that is the pathway that we ought to be following. Back to you.
Thank you. Before we move on to a final discussion section, please
Can
do.
I quickly add something to that?
Of course, ma'am. Please do.
I love what you just said, but what I would like to add is that the research questions and participatory research should include patients and the sites. So it should be everyone together. It should be a collaborative effect. But I totally agree that the power balance has been very paternalistic from different aspects, and we need to change that for better research. Yeah.
Maybe speaking to a question that perhaps bridges that, I'm going to go to a question from Urta Prentice. If we want to improve innovation, not only in vaccination, how can data protection and open science be reconciled? Acceleration in AI will be an advantage, but will it deepen the divide between those who operate with big data and those who cannot collect or acquire it? I suppose we're speaking to the digital divide, and yeah, Thomas, come back in if you would.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the big questions. How can you ensure, on the one hand, data privacy, and at the other hand, access to data, which is a necessity to really make use of it? I think the first thing is to tell the people what is in for them, why these data are collected. And I've always seen that there's an enormous willingness to share data if you make clear what it is for. They simply don't like that their data are being used without an idea. There's also ways of creating synthetic data sets, which are reflecting the data of a population or group by just reshuffling their data, that no individual is reflected, but the distribution of values is actually reflected. These are technologies which are really doing a pretty proper job. And there's also a trend at the moment, which we call federated learning, where I develop on, let's say, the accessible data an algorithm, and then I hand this algorithm to somebody who has data behind the firewall. They train on these and hand back a better algorithm. These are phenomenal new technologies which are satisfying many data privacy aspects, but the fundamental problem stays. We see that countries with electronic health records have an enormous advantage, yeah, in monitoring and in modeling, which is not the case in many parts of the world. Yeah.
Okay. Pamela, do you want to come back on the digital divide, as it were, or the how to bridge open science and data protection?
So the digital divide is real, right? Because if we're going to be using technology to get closer to patient, it implies that technology is accessible to everyone. And during the pandemic, we heard that even in the United States, 30% of kids, or was it 70? There was like some big amount of kids never made it to their Zoom classes at school. Right. So if you think about that in the context of healthcare, that may mean that people cannot do a Zoom call from their home because their kid has to do homework if there's only one computer in the house, or they may not have Wi-Fi. I mean, I have unlimited Wi-Fi, but some people have limited Wi-Fi and they may not have the bandwidth for sensors to transmit data or for their phone plans to transmit data. And so in the FDA guidance, there actually now is a mention that sponsors of clinical trial should make sure that people have access to internet, to Wi-Fi, and that maybe hotspots need to be provided, and that we should not be excluding people on that. And I live in Austin. I walk by the library on Sunday. People are sitting around the library to try to get the Wi-Fi from the library. So it is a real thing. I think we can reach a lot of people, but we have to just be aware that this might be cumulative upon a group of people that already don't have access to things, and that we have to figure out ways, maybe by providing and provisioning phones to patients so they can do their echoes on the phone. But we just have to be mindful of it and not assume that we're going to reach a whole lot of people when maybe we might not be reaching new people, other people. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Moving on to the last section, we've got sort of 25 minutes or so to go. Final big section, interdisciplinarity, is a central thrust of the Frontiers in Science lead article that we've been discussing. And it's around 10 years since the MIT and the US National Academies published a framework for interdisciplinarity and a concept of convergence to bring together different disciplines in active ways to collaborate toward research. And the Frontiers in Science article has a sort of updated account, if you like, learning also from COVID and the various collaborations. Michel, could I ask you first to comment? I'll perhaps ask each of you in turn to comment on interdisciplinarity from your own perspective. But Michel, could we start with you as the project lead?
Yes, of course. I think that everything starts in universities, in academia. We have really to teach the future scientists in a different way. We should attract them to go beyond their comfort zone. We should illustrate what interdisciplinarity allowed to perform in terms of COVID-19 research and especially vaccines. And this needs also to have new types of professors who are able indeed to give the appropriate examples and to stimulate future physicians and scientists to look for interdisciplinary research. Now, there is also a question of resources. If we look at grants which are dedicated to research, very often interdisciplinarity is not really considered as an advantage. Actually, it's more considered as a disadvantage, saying that, wow, this scientist is not focused enough. And I think that's a real problem. I think that we should dedicate more resources to interdisciplinary research. That would be my first answer, but I'm sure that my colleague will have others.
Indeed, indeed. Melanie, could we bring you back in? Of course, your work during COVID and beyond is by definition not only multidisciplinary, but also intersectoral. So how do you see the learnings of COVID and beyond for a future of true interdisciplinarity and intersectorality as well?
Yes, and just to note, working for an international NGO, and our mission is to advance health equity through partnerships and innovation. So I think that kind of shows how you really need to pull things together. And maybe we can use a couple of examples. And I would like to use the example of COVAX, where it did bring together end-to-end capabilities. I think COVAX is part of a journey of where we need to be. It's obviously not where it did not achieve everything it needed to achieve, but it did bring together all of the stakeholders from an end-to-end basis, including with countries, including with civil society organizations as a forum to do that. And a practical example, I would not have thought while doing clinical trials at a time of shortage, doing a clinical trial, doing fractional dosing. So see what immune response you can get from a small dose. Is that going to be better than shortage? Will have an impact on how the countries can deliver, because the syringe that they will use will not be able to deliver something if it is in an advantage. And having that forum where we have that discussion together was really valuable in the way that you design your clinical trial. So before that, we would never have thought of that small piece of information that would have meant that you could not deliver something. And moving on from that, we need to bring together multiple different disciplines: academia, industry, the non-for-profits, the downstream partners, the countries, the vaccinators, and the populations who are receiving the vaccines. We're a great believer in human-centered design. So, bringing into the research the end user, the on-the-ground vaccinator, or the people that are going to receive them. So you can have early input into the design of what you're doing. I think the main problem is everyone sees the need for coordination, but nobody wants to be coordinated. So how can we work in a collaborative way without feeling that I don't want to be coordinated? But yes, of course, we need coordination. So it is really about bringing people together. And how can you do that with transparency across the system to really think about doing things better?
Yeah. If I could come briefly, Pamela, to you on the same topic. Your work is is obviously on the sort of translation of testing therapies in populations. Therefore, there's an intersectoriality there between researchers and developers and so forth. Again, what's your take on the learnings? How, from your perspective, what needs to change for a better interdisciplinarity toward translating therapies from the lab into the clinic and into the population?
So I think in clinical trials, I worked for 10 years at the Clinical Trial Transformation Initiative. That clearly was a public-private partnership between the Food and Drug Administration, Duke University, and we had a multi-stakeholder consortium. So the idea that, to Melanie's point, you kind of need everybody's input from the front end so that you know what hurdles you may avoid down the road. And I think we've all come to realize maybe more that research and science is a team sport. I agree wholeheartedly with Michel that that's not necessarily taught in schools. It's sort of like you need to be the lead author and you can do this on your own, and the Nobel Prize is one person. There's kind of incentives are a little bit misaligned for this team approach and this collaborative approach, but I think we've understood that that is actually what gets us to better results faster, and I hope we can continue doing that. There's many collaborative groups, IHI, the city is still there, Multi-Regional Clinical Trial Center. So there's a lot of groups in clinical trials that are doing this. And actually, to get a better clinical trial itself, you need to do that too, because you need to work with the basic scientist people, the operations people, the participants, the sites, the PIs, the statisticians, to create a trial that actually gets you to your goal faster and better. So I think I'm always hopeful. You have to be hopeful in this business. And I hope we can do things better down the road. Yeah.
Thank you. And Olusoji, if you could bring you in, your viewpoint speaks greatly to an end-to-end approach, which by nature is, as we say, interdisciplinary and intersectoral. Could you comment again from your perspective on learning for the future? It's overlapping with previous aspects, I suppose, but that end-to-endness, please.
Thanks. On the end-to-endness, I'll start from the point that if indeed we're optimizing for end-to-endness, then an inevitable part of that from the interdisciplinary perspective is building a coalition, a coalition that is sufficiently robust to be credible with all the constituencies and to withstand different pressures. So during the educational period, I think Michel covered this just perfectly, so I'm not going to add to that, other than to emphasize the importance of including political scientists and business economists in that coalition. We saw how spectacularly science was limited during COVID, or deployment of science was limited during COVID because of defects on those fronts. A second aspect, which I think is important, is when we, again, looking at end-to-end, I think the notion of technology transfer needs to be challenged and also put to rest, because implicit in that construct is that technology is necessarily developed in a few wealthy countries in the global north and then transferred to others. I think more emphasis needs to be placed on technology development all over the world. That's very important. It goes beyond technology transfer. Then finally, excuse me, let me use a real life example, because the abstract concepts that we're talking about may not suffice. If you look at the R21 malaria vaccine, the essence of the global policy on access around this now is that it's going to be manufactured by the Serum Institute of India, and then, of course, shipped to countries where Plasmodium falciparum is most prevalent. If all one is optimizing for is just get the vaccines into people's bodies anyway, then that's a good thing. However, if you're thinking in terms of a more robust solution and an end-to-end architecture, it is a strategic blunder. That vaccine should be manufactured on the continent being ravaged being most ravaged by Plasmodium falciparum malaria, and it will not suffice to have token approaches where a few firms on the African continent do just fill and finish. It has to be end to end. Back to you.
Thank you. Before we come to some last thoughts, just lastly on your perspective here, Thomas, your work is very diverse in integrating different fields. And if I may say, Thomas, you are somewhat of a futurist, perhaps. So if I could, could you give us a sense of, from your perspective, on interdisciplinarity of the future? What does it look like? What should it look like in 10 years from your perspective, given the need to integrate technologies with biomedical sciences as well?
I mean, without belittling the suffering which the pandemic has caused, and it was also a fantastic natural experiment. You've imagined millions of people participated in this involuntary experiment, but under relatively uniform conditions of seeing a pathogen the first time, very similar pathogens and ways of getting it. So there is obviously an opportunity now to cut this mountain of data in very many different ways and analyze them. So it is a chance to really understand, why are we different? Why are the success rates or the survival rates so different between different populations? Why is the intervention not uniformly successful? There's many ways, and this requires interdisciplinarity. And it will still leave us with an enormous mountain of data, which we can only integrate with the modern tools, especially because AI, which is the one which lends it to this analysis, shines only when you have a broad variety of modalities, different data types. You can use descriptive statistics if you look into only one type of data, into one study setting. But as soon as you want to feed in this new entity, it is wonderful if this comes from different disciplines, from their different approaches, in order to integrate and get a more comprehensive view, and not just the very restricted view each and any of us can have with our own discipline and then our own type of measurements. Yeah.
Thanks. Okay, last few questions really, or last few thoughts. And one aspect which again is raised in some of the questions speaks to, so far we've spoken about different kinds of scientists. We've spoken about different kinds of technology developers or data scientists as well, and even regulators and policymakers. Coming back to not so much the end user, but the end recipient, the public, the society at large. How do we, what did COVID tell us about the future of a better engagement between scientists, let's say, healthcare providers and the public? And coming back maybe to that right, one of the questions about the right of the public to be involved in the making of science, and this is the public in all regions, of course. Can I maybe first of all, Pamela, your work is specifically designed to do this, but more each of you as well, perhaps Melanie as well. How do we ensure that the public is the partner in this and integrated in this interdisciplinarity, if you like, from that perspective too?
So there are many groups that have worked on this. In Europe, UPADI is a patient advocacy group that is heavily getting involved in sort of the design of clinical trials, what research questions to ask. And then in the US, we also have different groups. PCORI is one of the groups that is trying to really bring forward research that is patient-driven. Is the patient, So I think in clinical trials, we are trying to create vehicles. It's not always easy. And I think it mostly goes through patient advocacies and patient representatives themselves or caregivers. of patients. If you think about the broader public, the people that, I don't know if like that correlation feels a little harder to me to include them, but I think there are avenues now, and even ICH-E8, which talked about how you should design a clinical trial protocol, says in there that you should talk to patient advocates and patients living with the disease to make sure that the trials are the right trials and you're asking the right questions and you're focusing on what the issues are for people living with those diseases. So I think that would be my first answer, but I'm really interested to see what other people are saying too.
Melanie first, I think.
Yes. So, I mean, I think there are multiple pieces to this. In the clinical trial context, community participation has been something that has been well recognized for a long time. And I really feel that is the responsibility of the investigator, because it is their population to make sure that they are doing that in a relevant way for their own population, that goes through the local ethics committee, et cetera, et cetera. So from a clinical trial perspective, I think generally that is well recognized. I think some of what we've been talking about, though, is much more upstream than that. I mean, I think, the question of, what actually are the country's priorities if you're developing a vaccine? What would they actually like to see on their top priority that they don't have? To drive the R&D, I think, is an important question that we should be asking the countries. And then the funders are funding those projects, which are the highest priority, is important. And then in that early development stage, the notion of the human-centered design, and get the downstream folks involved in that early design of a product, and that continuous development loop going around, because too often we are producing products that people don't want, and that needs to change.
Thank you. Michel, you raised a hand.
Yes, I think that a very important point here is health literacy. I think that to get the support of the patients, of their caregiver, it's very important that they understand what we are talking about. And, you see so many stupid notions on social networks. It's very important that we organize ourselves to convey the right messages to this audience. And it is my experience spending very often times in schools that even children can understand what infectious disease mean and how vaccines are working. And I think that this aspect of health literacy is very important to get the support of patients and their families and the caregivers.
Yeah. Thomas, I think you raised a hand as well.
Yeah, I think in short, the response to COVID was a success on the science side, but it was largely a failure on the communication and policy side. And again, I think technologies are coming in, lending themselves to education and dissemination, like AI, which can identify fake news and can help to somehow reduce their impact. I think for the next pandemic, we should be prepared with the respective tools which are targeting society and not our lab benches.
Indeed. And finally, Olusoji, may I ask you to come in on this one?
Yes, thank you. Just building on the prior comments, I think one aspect that needs to be recognized and perhaps emphasized is the importance of every government taking responsibility for the health of its own citizens. Because a part of the reason that we saw such gross inequity during the COVID pandemic, i.e. in terms of the access to the vaccines, or timely and equitable access to the vaccines, is because over the decades, many governments in low and middle income countries had basically abdicated responsibility and outsourced them to a few Geneva-based international organizations. And those chickens came home to roost during the pandemic. So I think the truth needs to be said that those governments need to step up and take responsibility for growing and ensuring the finance of research networks within their own countries and sub-regions. Otherwise, we are going to relive this cycle time and again. Back to you.
Exactly. I was going to come to each of you for a final thought. The article is titled, we've been discussing, is titled Standing the Test of COVID-19. And it's both about that test. Did research infrastructures, did science withstand that test, and what's the new frontiers of medicine? So maybe staying with you for a moment, Olusoji, is that your take-home message? Did we stand the test? And if not, how do we stand it better next time and make sure health systems are better prepared to serve the needs of populations? Each of you, I'll prepare you, each of you has, say, 20, 30 seconds on that. And seeing as you're speaking, Olusoji, we'll go to you first, please.
Thanks. I think in terms of just product development, just the upstream R&D alone, yes, that was a spectacular success during COVID. But in terms of equitable global access, it was a spectacular failure. Now, if we're to do better over time, it means a realignment of the power imbalances, and it means that the governments in low and middle income countries take more responsibility for financing and improving their own health systems, and that the scientists in those countries get more support, domestic and external, for strengthening their own research networks, for strengthening their laboratories, and also for improving cross-country collaboration across the Global South. Back to you.
Thank you. Melanie, please, if you would, pick up from there.
Thank you. Yeah, all I can say is a lot of progress was made, but it still didn't get us to where we needed to be. And the equitable access piece was a critical piece of that. Even if the intention was there, we did not make it. And I think my concluding remarks are we've learned so much, and we need to look at the lessons learned and apply those moving forward. We have plenty of opportunity. We've got an mpox public health emergency of international concern. How can we build on the lessons learned for COVID of not getting where we need to for mpox and for the future outbreaks that we see?
Thank you. Pamela, please, if you would.
So I think my comments align with what was said already. I think we've made a lot of progress already. I think some of that progress is stalling a little bit, honestly. I do believe people forget. Kind of, because after, especially relating to the clinical trial infrastructure, people were like, oh, we need a better clinical trial infrastructure. We need to create it now, keep it warm, so that for the next pandemic, it'll be ready. But it's kind of hard to set all those things up. And I think we need to stick with it and not forget that these things are terrible when they happen, but we should take them as an opportunity to do something better in the future. And that's not easy. And the equitable part of it is definitely something we need to address. Infrastructure and just making sure that we can get trials to everybody everywhere.
Yeah. Perhaps open science, open access is important as well. The open sharing of data and so forth too. Thomas, and first Thomas and then Michel, if you could cover it off on your final take on thoughts of this.
I thought that we have missed one important aspect of this article in the discussion, which is the exposome aspect, which was actually pretty strong, because one of the takeaways was actually the pandemic has shown how much the difference in lifestyle factors and exposures are impacting. And this is stimulating at the moment an important movement. There will be in May next year a moonshot for an human exposome project to complement the human genome by major organizations, for example. And I think this is something which the pandemic has nicely shown. It is not just genetics. We need to also look into other factors of disease pathogenesis.
And finally, Michel, co-leader, it falls to you in Philippe's absence today, sadly. Hello, Philippe, when you watch this on YouTube. Michel, over to you, your final reflections on this project, perhaps, and your own thoughts for the future of medicine.
as far as I am concerned, what I learned during this discussion is that indeed we had great success, but also we have to do much better in different aspects in the fight against pandemic, and hopefully we will be better prepared for the next pandemic. So that's one point. Now, my final conclusion will be a quote from Marie Curie. Nothing in life is to be feared, it is only to be understood.
Very much.
Thank you.
Well, that brings us to the close of today. I'd like to, of course, thank you very much. Thank to Thomas Hartung, to Pamela Tenaerts, to Melanie Saville, to Olusoji Adeyi, and of course to Professor Michel Goldman. It's been a pleasure to be with you all today. Thank you to everyone from around the world for your attendance. I hope you enjoyed the session. Please do visit the Frontiers in Science website to view the article that we've been discussing and its hub of content. But for now, from myself, from all our guests, goodbye. See you next time.
And thank you to everyone, and to Lee as a wonderful moderator.
Thank you, Michel. Take care, everyone.